These Date with History lectures we do in the spirit of our educational mission. We the people, our Constitution tells us, are responsible for the common defense, and that's why we have a Constitution. It's one of the purposes for which we have the Constitution. And in order for we the people, or for us the people, I'm not sure which is grammatically correct, but anyway, in order for a citizenry to be responsible for its own defense in a country that governs itself, which we claim to do, we have to know something about it. And we live in an age when fewer and fewer people have personal experience with our military institutions, our veterans, our wars, the battles that we fought. And so we have this series of lectures that help us understand our military past, and we're proud to bring a whole line of distinguished speakers here on almost a monthly basis to serve that purpose. Tonight's speaker is just a terrific addition to our agenda. My good friend, Dr. Jörg Muth, who has come to us all the way from Germany and has spent the last 36 hours trying to overcome his jet lag so that he will be able to present his talk tonight on his recently, I think 2011 book, Command Culture, Officer Education in the U.S. Army and the German Armed Forces, 1901 to 1940, and the Consequences for World War II, a subject which he says in his last chapter is still very much germane to the United States as we contemplate the national security challenges of what we hope are the waning days of the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we think about what the future may hold. Dr. Muth received his PhD in history from the University of Utah. He is the author of one previous book, and with my deep apologies to Jörg, Flucht aus dem militärischen Alltag, Ursachen und individuelle Ausprägung der Desertion in der Armee Friedrichs des Großen. Was I close? Yeah. Which, for those of you who are very curious, is a cultural and social study of desertion in the Prussian army in the era of Frederick the Great. Okay, this probably gives you some clue as to why I never got quite what I ordered in restaurants in Germany. I'm always sort of curious about it. But this book, Command Culture, is very assertively written, thoroughly documented, wonderfully reviewed by scholars in Europe and scholars in the United States. General Ray Odierno, the current Chief of Staff of the Army, has put it on the Chief of Staff of the Army required reading list for the officers of the Army. The Commandant of the Marine Corps has made it required reading for the Senior Non-Commissioned Officer Corps and Intermediate Officers of the United States Marine Corps, and it has been recognized twice by the Army Historical Foundation with a Distinguished Book Award. So this is a great piece of historical research and writing. There is much controversy in it, but controversy is good. It makes us think. And on that note, I will let Jörg tell you all about it. So welcome to Cantini, and particularly a warm welcome to Dr. Jörg Muth.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you for the invitation to speak here tonight, and thank you very much for the hospitality that has been extended to me by the leadership and the staff of this fine museum. And thank you to you for appearing in such large numbers. Let me apologize beforehand for my accent, which will tonight be stronger than usual. While my body firmly knows it is near Chicago, my brain still thinks it is in Germany. My presentation today will consist of two parts. One covering my book Command Culture and the Officer Education in a Historical Perspective. And in the second part, I would like to talk about command culture in the U.S. Army of today and the challenges of modern wars. I also brought you some pictures which I would like to show you at the end if you are still awake. There will be no PowerPoint tonight. The reason for that is General Mattis. You all know General Mattis of Marine Corps fame. He once said, PowerPoint makes people stupid. That has been scientifically proven, even though not with those exact words. As you can see, Marines lead the way, sometimes even in science. PowerPoint either oversimplifies complex issues or completely fails to make sense of them, because with slides, you can only do so much. Case in point is the infamous Afghan stability coin dynamics slide, which is these days better known as the spaghetti picture. It was shown to General Stanley McChrystal to explain the impact of counterinsurgency tactics in Afghanistan. The slide looked like a huge plate of spaghetti on which someone had puked. There were hundreds of strings of different puke colors with some clusters mixed in between on which the strings hung. When he saw the slide, General McChrystal remarked dryly, "When we understand that slide, we'll have won the war." The slide was not understood, and the war was not won. All the fault of PowerPoint. Maybe not. Maybe it was also the fault of officers who come up with such slides, who maybe should have been interior decorators or fashion designers instead of choosing the profession of arms. The problem is not only the slide itself, but also the attitude behind it and the professional military education that creates such an attitude. From the perspective of a social scientist, mainly two sorts of people apply to become an officer. Those who want to be all they can be, who see problems as challenges, even grave problems. Those who want to lead, take responsibility, and never shirk away from both. Those who love people, but do not shy away from combat. The others love regulations. They feel secure, even cozy and comfortable in an environment where everything is written down and can be looked up, and where you are told how to fold your pants. Where if you always agree and stay long enough, even if your performance is mediocre, you will slowly rise and gain privilege through rank. Those are also the ones who love to make PowerPoint slides. Obviously, you don't want the latter in an army. However, the US Army has never in its existence been good at getting rid of them. This is a problem of selection and education, and that is what my book is about. You might want to know how my book came into existence. It was rather unplanned, and that might make for the best history books, because there is no bias and no preconceived opinion or hypothesis that has to be defended. When you write your dissertation in Germany, it is not necessary to develop a thesis that the author has to defend. A historian follows his erkenntnisleitendem Interesse. That is one of those very long, awesome German terms, and it basically means the scholar goes where his interest and his discoveries lead him, based on the facts that he learns while researching. The great advantage of this procedure is a more neutral approach to a topic, because there is no thesis to defend. The disadvantage is that German dissertations often make for extraordinary boring reading. I avoided that in my book. So when you study military history in Germany, you have to do the Reichswehr and the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces of the interwar years, and the Third Reich, up and down and inside out. The US Army barely ever shows up. For me, however, the US Army was the most fascinating topic. The reason for that is portrayed in the afterword of my book. And I'm not going to tell you here because I want you to buy the book. So I studied the US Army and the German armies closely together. One because I had to, and the other one because I wanted to. When reading the memoirs of American officers, I noticed how little they knew about their German counterparts. In fact, I noticed that they were wrong in their assessments much of the time. Therefore, I decided that my dissertation topic would be a history and an analysis of the perception the US officers had of their German counterparts, and how that perception changed from interwar days to the Second World War to the German rearmament. Very interesting, I can tell you. But the projected size of that study was between 550 to 600 pages, which is the normal size a German historical dissertation has. But as I was writing my dissertation at an American university, that was deemed to be way too voluminous by some of my advisors. At the same time, I had already written a chapter which I needed as a writing sample to apply for a fellowship at Harvard University. And that chapter dealt with the perception the US officers had of the German officer education. That was already very, very interesting. And so thought those who read it, and they suggested to me to expand this chapter into my whole dissertation. And that is how command culture came into being. Comparing the German and American officer education and selection was not only interesting because they fought against each other, but also because of their former excellent relationship that dated back to the times of Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great I always call Fritze, because that's the name his family gave him. So my first book is actually about the desertion in the old Prussian army, and therefore I know Fritze very well. Fritze had an excellent relationship to the colonists in America, and when they rebelled, a small faction among them thought they might not be able to do without the king, and were looking for a king of America. The next older brother after Fritze was Heinrich, called Heini, and he was contacted by this faction if he were interested to become king of America. As you all know, nothing came of it. I'm not kidding. So, but that is very unfortunate for you, because with the Prussian king, there would be no government shutdown. And you would always have a balanced budget. So according to observers of the War of Independence, one of the most read books among George Washington's officers was Fritze's Instructions for the Generals of Infantry. Consequently, the Continental Army requested military advisors from Fritze, but the Prussian king was only willing to release who he thought to be a second-rate officer, and that was Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Steuben proved that Fritze could err in his assessment of officers because von Steuben was exactly what Washington needed. The Hessian contingents hired by the British to fight the rebels came as Prussian clones, a fact that was most likely only known to von Steuben. All European armies had copied the Prussians to some extent. The Hessians had copied them even down to the cut of their uniforms. You all know what happened later, after the Prussian officer appeared on the scene. Because von Steuben helped Washington and his ragtag army, the Americans finally won the War of Independence. When Napoleon appeared on the international stage of war-making, the Americans shifted their interest from Prussia to France. The former glorious Prussian army had been beaten at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt in the year of 1806. Just as the Hessians had so frantically copied the Prussians in the 18th century, the Americans now copied the French. American officers attended the French cavalry school and translated many manuals of the French army. It appeared that the US Army had little self-confidence and constantly needed to emulate other armies to some extent. While seeking input from outward sources should be mandatory for an army, for not to become rigid in its ways, slavish adoption should be avoided. Between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, 105 American officers visited Europe and mostly France. The adoption of Napoleonic battle tactics beyond reason and for far too long had catastrophic repercussions when brother fought against brother in the American Civil War. In 1866, the whole attitude of the US Army changed again when the Prussians pulled off something the Union Army had tried in vain for 4 years. The swift movement of separate armies through separate channels over a long distance and their unification to fight a decisive and victorious battle. That was the Battle of Königgrätz. The Prussians fought against the Austrians. The American officers now visiting Europe stayed in Prussia most of the time and not so much in France anymore. Their perspective also had changed. While for decades they had looked out for what kind of saddles and uniforms the Europeans used, the form of the bayonets and sabers, they now came to realize that there was something about officer education that was also different. The type of officer the Prussians had created was different. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871 only reinforced that vision. What the Americans considered the ultimate war-winning institution was the German Great General Staff, an organization in which highly educated staff officers supposedly were doing nothing else but war planning and thus could direct operations in a superior manner. To the defense of the Americans, it has to be said that most other observing foreign officers thought the same. I call that in my book the Great General Staff Fantasy. In 1890, Spencer Wilkinson wrote his very influential book, The Brain of an Army, that pushed the image of the German General Staff as supposedly superior war-winning institution. What they all missed was the fact that even staffs have to be led. The Prussian Great General Staff excelled under the leadership of Helmuth Karl Bernhard von Moltke. You know him as Moltke the Elder. And it totally sucked in later years. What had been the brain of the army would easily become its tumor with the wrong people at the helm. It is not an accident that two of the greatest chiefs of staff in history, Moltke the Elder and George C. Marshall, shared the same trait, leadership by common sense. And that when they were retired, both the organizations they had led did not perform well anymore. One of the higher-ranking officers who visited Germany was General Philip Henry Sheridan. Bearing in mind that the U.S. Army was going to reform with the German system as a blueprint, he cautioned that an imitation of the Prussian scheme in details instead of in its spirit would be a mistake. That an imitation of the Prussian scheme in its details instead of in its spirit would be a mistake. But that is exactly what happened. In May 1881, General William Sherman, who was then commanding general of the U.S. Army, founded at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the School of Application for the Infantry and Cavalry. The school would go through many name changes until finally becoming the Command and General Staff College. The many name changes indicate already that the U.S. Army did not really know what to do with the school. While the U.S. Army, now for the first time, had something like an educational facility for intermediate officers, it still did not possess a general staff. The Spanish-American War accelerated the development because the U.S. Army experienced a mobilization that can only be described as totally chaotic. Way worse even than the building up for the Civil War, and that means a lot. Sardonically, a colonel who was pestered with daily demands from Washington wrote back to the bureaucrats in the War Department, "I just received 200 soldiers who have never seen a horse, 100 horses who have never seen a soldier, and 6 second lieutenants who have never seen either. I am taking the field tomorrow." Because of those experiences, the new Secretary of War, Elihu Root, was finally able to pass 2 reform bills. In 1900, the Army War College was created, and in 1903, the War Department General Staff. For the General Staff, the Americans used nearly verbatim the German regulations. In creating the Army War College, they went one step further than the Germans, who did not possess such an institution that was supposed to train colonels to become generals. The Germans thought that if an officer was able to command a regiment, he would be able to command anything. Ladies and gentlemen, you have now survived the historical introduction. When looking at the creation of a command culture, I could not start in the middle, but I had to go to the beginning. I had to review the military academies in the US and in Germany, the Kadettenschulen, the cadet schools. Studies that before my book had looked into officer education had compared hours taught, like 3 hours military history taught or tactics taught and so on. That I considered no longer to be sufficient. I am an experienced instructor myself in a variety of topics, and I know that didactics are often decisive. I'm sure that every one of you can remember an outstanding teacher from your time at high school or college who was able to bring a topic to life and encourage learning, and another who could ruin even the most interesting topic. Therefore, I wanted to know who taught at military schools and how they taught, but also how those instructors were selected. Something else was most important to me, and that is what kind of end product those schools wanted to create. What was an officer supposed to be, and how was he supposed to command? And I noticed something from the beginning, that an officer in the US Army was something totally different from an officer in one of the German armies. Earlier books, and even some today, who deal with military institutions, and especially military schools, cite at length the regulations of the schools and the statements of superintendents, commandants, and instructors. Those are so-called normative sources, and they are insufficient to build a case. Normative sources show an historian how people wished things to be, but not necessarily how things were. Armies always set up dog and pony shows, and the historian has the duty to make an effort to see through them. Therefore, I went to the archives and dug up the letters and diaries of former cadets and students. What did they think about their military school when they were actually there? And I can tell you that what the superintendent of West Point wrote about his school is totally different than what the cadets wrote at that time. But why look at West Point at all? When you write a study with limited resources, and that is what a dissertation is, you have to narrow down your sample. There were between 250,000 and 280,000 officers in the German and the US armies each during World War II. Way too many to study unless you have a fully equipped professorship and a herd of research assistants. So you all know the names Patton, Eisenhower, MacArthur, Bradley, Ridgway, and Collins. They were all West Pointers. So while West Point graduated only a fraction of the officers serving in World War II, many of the graduates achieved the highest ranks and positions. And it was the same in Germany with the graduates of the cadet schools. You know the names Guderian, Rommel, von Manstein, and Keitel, for example. So that's why I was looking at the cadet schools and at West Point. In Germany, there were 9 preparatory cadet schools in which cadets could start at the age of 10. At that time, Germany was so militarized that young boys would not run from the cadet schools. They would run to them. I read 2 accounts from boys who pestered their parents for months until they allowed them to attend the cadet schools. It is today nearly impossible to convey the prestige an officer had in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. Being an officer was the most highly regarded profession in Germany, period. An officer stood one step above the Pope and one below the Emperor. At that time, Germans used to say, only with the rank of lieutenant are you starting to become a human being. That was not always meant entirely seriously, but you get the idea. In producing officers, the Kadettenschulen went an entirely different way than West Point. German cadets were allowed to leave the premises regularly on weekends, while in West Point they were confined for 1 year, even though the West Pointers were up to 10 years older than their German counterparts. The key word here is trust. Hazing had been outlawed at the German Kadettenschulen at the end of the 19th century because it was counterproductive for creating independent and self-confident leaders. And that ban was not paid lip service, like for centuries at West Point, but it was backed up by provisions. Cadets caught hazing lost rank, and more important, they lost face in front of the Corps of Cadets. Hazing was correctly considered a leadership weakness in Germany. All new cadets got an upperclassman who helped them get settled in and who was charged with protecting them. Cadets slept in rooms of 8 to 10 with an upperclassman in charge of the room, the so-called room elder. He was responsible for the cleanliness of the room, the appearance of the junior cadets, and their grades. A hazed cadet does not perform well, and thus the room elder had every incentive to protect his charges. Directly adjacent to the rooms of the cadets lived the tactical officer. He was a lieutenant who had just been commissioned or promoted, not much older than the oldest cadets, and who thus could relate to them. Unlike at West Point, seniority was not set in stone. A younger cadet could pass over an older cadet in Germany in rank, because in addition to school classes, all cadets were divided into moral classes. All performances counted towards the standing in the moral classes: academic, athletics, appearance, but above all, leadership. Cadets in moral class 1 had additional leave, while cadets in the lowest class no leave at all. They were also required to carry a special mark on their uniform, and a senior cadet from the first moral class followed them everywhere. The award system worked exactly opposite to the award system at West Point. There were great incentives for doing the right thing, instead of just punishment for doing something wrong. The teaching was also totally different. In German military schools, teachers were selected like in civilian schools. They were required to have passed a federal examination or possess a higher degree from a university. At West Point, senior faculty, who often did not possess a higher degree themselves, selected only other West Pointers who in turn often had long forgotten about the topic they were supposed to teach. At the Kadettenschulen, the curriculum followed exactly that of a German civilian school, the so-called Realgymnasium, with added hours for athletics and military drill. Military educators publicly discussed the contents of curricula and possible school reforms with civilian educators. At West Point, 70% of the curriculum consisted of mathematics, engineering, and natural sciences. The Academy's senior faculty was fanatic in their belief that only a high dose of those fields could build what they called mental discipline that would allow the future officer to prevail on the battlefield. However, in hundreds of years of military history, no such thing has ever been proven. Yet whenever there was an inquiry about the totally outdated curriculum of West Point, twice even from presidents, the faculty got away riding that old horse of mental discipline. Cadets who had excellent grades in leadership would be separated from the academy if they failed in mathematics. At the Kadettenschulen in Germany, cadets would be passed again and again, and if their instructors thought them to be outstanding leaders, even though their grades were bad. They would find at the end the Latin remark on their degrees, propter barbarum, which means nearly uneducated. At the age of 14, Kadetten could be transferred to the Hauptkadettenanstalt, the main cadet institution in Berlin. After 3 to 4 more years, only those who made their way into a special prodigy course would be graduated as commissioned lieutenants. More than 95% would leave as some form of ensign, still officer aspirants and not commissioned officers. They would now enter a regiment and there had to show that they could command real soldiers and not only fellow cadets. Only after they were deemed fit, they were sent to the Kriegsschule, the war school, which is not to be confused with the famous Kriegsakademie, the war academy. We will come to that institution later. The Kriegsschule was for ensigns. There, they did not enter generic classes, but were put together with their education and future branch in mind. At the Kriegsschule, the ensigns learned company tactics and to handle all infantry weapons in the arsenal. After the ensign returned to the regiment, the officer corps of the regiment would decide if he was finally worthy to be commissioned. The most junior officer would speak first, while the regimental commander had the last and most decisive vote. Only after all that would a German officer candidate be made a real officer, not automatically after 4 years, like at West Point. In the United States, the military schools vegetated in an insular existence, and there was no clear vision what the end product was supposed to be. While in Germany, all military schools were connected with each other, West Point did not communicate with the Command and General Staff School regarding its curriculum, nor did the Command and General Staff School communicate with the Army War College. After 1.5 decades of its existence, the Command and General Staff School acquired the nickname kindergarten within the U.S. Army. The officers were required to read loud in the classroom from regulations and textbooks. The exams dealt with the drill regulations, and the students were told what kind of pencil to use for the examinations. That was the level for officer candidates. Yet captains and majors with 10 years of experience in the Army attended the school. High-ranking officers desperately tried to raise the reputation of the school, and because of that, rather than for the value of its teaching, the Command and General Staff School became more and more important. It is possible that at this time, the U.S. Army Officer Corps developed its ticket-punching mentality. Officers thought that they would have disadvantages in regard of promotion if they never attended the school. But how to get there was a mystery to many because the rules changed often and were not disseminated to eligible officers. Instructors at the Command and General Staff School were usually surplus officers, and there is no evidence that they had been selected for their ability in didactics or even proficiency in the topic they taught. Former students of the Command and General Staff School wrote their comrades who were about to attend the school not to argue with the instructors. That would only get them into trouble. The instructors were considered to be stiff, humorless, and boring. All were required to teach according to school doctrine and not to deviate from it. War games were stopped when the instructor made his point, and the high grade was only to be reached when the student hit the infamous school solution during a map exercise or an examination in tactics. Thus, you have student officers worrying at night, not what cool tactical solution would be, but what kind of solution the instructor would choose. All that left most students with a pretty unhappy experience of the Command and General Staff School. In Germany, every library carried books about how to get to a military school and what kind of knowledge was required to succeed there. Exam questions of the previous year were regularly published. The whole military educational system presents itself in total transparency. To attend the famous Kriegsakademie, the War Academy, an officer had to pass the very difficult up to 5-day-long Defense District Examination. The German word is Wehrkreisprüfung, Defense District Examination. Eligible were all second and first lieutenants with an experience between 5 to 8 years, who had obtained permission from their regimental commanders. The preparation to attend the district defense examination took 1 to 1.5 years. There were regular courses within the regiment where those officers who had already done the examination helped the younger comrades to study for it. At all levels, German officers were required to be teachers, and they were taught how to be one. One of the most important tasks for the young officers to solve at the Defense District Examination consisted of applied tactics. The applicant would get a map with a detailed description, and he now had to write his assessment of the situation and the orders for his unit, which was a reinforced regiment. So a lieutenant was required to command a reinforced regiment, a job normally suited for someone 15 years his senior. Other questions covered the German constitution, European geography and history, and instructions in athletics. There were also questions related to his branch and the translation of several sentences from a foreign language into German and vice versa. The examination had a whole athletics section: swimming, track and cross-country running, jumping, and of course hand grenade throwing. Each segment offered different multipliers. The points for applied tactics were multiplied by 4, while the questions about the Constitution were doubled. Unique for this examination was the fact that the applicants were asked for their opinion. The Wehrkreisprüfung of 1924 featured the question, what are the technical means of communication of a cavalry regiment? Are they sufficient in mobile warfare? Offer recommendations for improvements. A question like that would be posed in every examination. In contrast to the United States, junior officers were held in high regard in Germany. Brilliance and creativity was always looked for in the German system, but both traits were not necessary to get an exceptional score. It is important to point out that not even congruence with the grading officer solution was relevant. Exemplary solutions were extremely well thought through. The orders were clearly stated, or clear judgment was shown. Also, fresh ideas but clear considerations were important. And again, audacity and decisiveness. While historians have been so focused on the excellent education that German officers received at the Kriegsakademie, they have completely overlooked the exhaustive preparation that the officers had to undergo to even apply for the district examination. This preparation in itself consisted of an awesome education. At the end, only a fraction of those who had been tested were allowed to enter the Kriegsakademie. There, small classes of 12 to 15 officers awaited them, and a main instructor who was only few years older and 1 rank above them. The relationship was not one of student and teacher, but that of comrades who could all learn from each other. Consequently, there existed no school solution at the Kriegsakademie. After an exercise, the whole class discussed each solution of each student and the instructor. And quite often, they went with the solution of one of the students. Such a procedure guaranteed the creation of flexible minds and many alternative options to choose from, should the officer ever encounter in war a situation even remotely resembling the one in the classroom. The main instructors for the Kriegsakademie were chosen on a competitive basis, and they not only had to display extraordinary knowledge in their main teaching fields, there was tactics and military history, but also in didactics. Most officers left the Kriegsakademie with a deep sense of satisfaction, and the teachers earned high praise. That praise was echoed uniformly by officer exchange students from the United States and the Soviet Union who had attended the Kriegsakademie. What were the results of these two different approaches to officer education? Whereas in the United States, the officer was considered one cog among others in the huge machine, one member of the vast team. In Germany, the officer was considered the switch to the machine, or his whole power source. Accordingly, the utmost care was taken in selecting officers in Germany, and no costs were too high and no challenges too great. Paradoxically, the young Germans grew up in a highly authoritarian society, but would go through an advanced and nearly liberal professional military educational system. The reverse was true for the young Americans aspiring to become officers. They would grow up in a society which would grant them the greatest freedom in the world, as long as they were white, but they would submit under an extremely harsh and narrow-minded military educational system. The US Army's professional military educational system produced for World War II an average officer who knew the basics of his trade in theory because he had run through a number of schools which had taught him that. He generally longed for doctrine and prepared solutions, and he lacked flexibility and aggressiveness. If the most important verb and the most important noun should be found for the US Army and the Wehrmacht, according to the vast amount of manuals, regulations, letters, diaries, and autobiographies I have read, they would be to manage, and doctrine for the US Army, and führen, that is to lead, and Angriff, attack, for the Wehrmacht. Such a comparison alone points out the fundamentally different command culture in both armies. If the Germans were so great, why the heck did they lose the war? And why were they involved in many war crimes and atrocities in such great numbers? The answer again is their officer education. Being an officer had been for centuries the foremost profession in Germany, and many German officers suffered from a terminal case of arrogance. They constantly underestimated the abilities of their enemies. The iron strength of the Germans' officer training focused on tactical command, in which they were unrivaled, and that helped only up to the command of a corps, but not above that. To win a war, strategic vision is required. That was not taught in Germany. The selection process worked in Germany only up to the rank of lieutenant general. After that, many promotions were political. Thus, we have at the outset of World War II a host of sycophant senior generals surrounding Hitler, who often had rarely or never commanded a unit. They could not or would not relate to what was going on at the front lines. They ruthlessly reined in the younger commanders of mobile units. That had never happened before in German military history. A German officer aspirant is taught already that in war everything is feasible and possible, and that to win the next war, new weapons are needed and possibly a new mindset. Thus, when the war of annihilation in the East was propagated by their senior commanders, too many accepted that too readily and took part in criminal actions. However, my study clearly points out that every German officer had had a choice, more so than officers in other armies. Not only did exist in Germany a centuries-old tradition of disobedience and speaking one's mind to a superior officer, but that was also taught in the schools. The US Army Officer Corps of World War II consisted of a group of mediocre officers that was pulled time and again by a few star performers. Those star performers did not exist because of the American professional military education system, but despite it. They suffered through West Point and held on for a variety of reasons, mainly because of family encouragement. And they again held on through the interwar period when the army budget was cut to pieces and real soldiering was barely possible. They held on because they loved the army so much. All of them were brought up in solid families that had emphasized education, character, and the desire to grow. Outstanding officers consumed great amounts of books of all types, but especially about military history, a topic which can be considered essential for every officer. That topic had been neglected during their professional military education. From their book order lists, book inventories, discussion of various books in their correspondence, and existing officers' libraries, a direct connection between outstanding officership and avid readership can be drawn. That is the case, for example, for George C. Marshall, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Walter Kruger, George Patton, Matthew Bunker Ridgway, Lucian Truscott, and Joe Lawton Collins. One very important exception of the bleak official education they received was the infantry school at Fort Benning, when George C. Marshall was assistant commandant. With the help of a German exchange student, Marshall basically tried to run the place like a small version of the Kriegsakademie. It is evident from the correspondence of those who attended the infantry school at that time that they gained invaluable training. In stark contrast to the German army, mavericks were not taught or fostered in the US Army. Brilliant American officers, which were ahead of their time, were often instead either phased out to a position of no promotion or even court-martialed for their heretical ideas. Before George C. Marshall became Chief of Staff of the US Army, officers were actively discouraged from thinking outside of the box. What does all that mean for the US Army of today? Are there traces left from the old insufficient officer education? Unfortunately, there are. Excuse me. In small wars of counterinsurgencies, smaller units are involved, and therefore more junior officers will make important decisions. However, making independent decisions is already a problem for brigade commanders in the US Army. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, Baghdad was encircled by the US Army and the Marines. No real plan existed how to end the war, while Hussein was holed up in the city with his annoying propaganda minister making daily derogatory comments about the US Armed Forces performance. The leadership of the 3rd Infantry Division, the Rock of the Marne, was sufficiently incensed to try an approach that would ultimately end the stalemate and bring the Hussein regime down. A battalion-sized armored incursion would weaken the lay of the land, which was the 4-lane highway network of this part of Baghdad. And it would surprise the enemy and keep him off balance. This raid, called Thunder Run, was completely against current US Army doctrine and thus opposed by 5 Corps in Kuwait and the Theater Command in Doha. The raid was also a complete success. It was followed up by a brigade-sized attack into the Green Zone, again against the orders of 5 Corps, where the 3rd Infantry Division stayed. Shortly after that, the Hussein regime collapsed because the success of the US Army had become visible, now even to the media. What the leadership of the 3rd Infantry Division displayed was as close to Auftragstaktik, mission command, as the US Army would ever get. However, the Thunder Run was done against doctrine, against the superior's wishes, and it is a unique case. The US Army tries to introduce mission command at the moment, but with its current structure and approach, it will not succeed. Mission command is the enemy of doctrine, and mission command works only when a small officer corps is trained to have a flexible mind, and when frontline command is valued over staff command. Mission command cannot be ordered. It has to be taught and lived on all levels. This is not the case at the moment, and that has occasionally tragic consequences. Most of you might know the example of Medal of Honor recipient Captain Will Swenson, who is connected to this institution because he was part of a 1st Infantry Division military transition team in Afghanistan. On September 8, 2009, Captain Swenson's unit was ambushed. Despite repeated pleas for fire support, higher staff thought it knew the situation better than the commanding officer on the ground, and any support was denied for hours while Swenson's unit put up a desperate fight. Many survived the day only because of the heroic efforts of a few, but heroic efforts can never be a substitute for a proper command culture. Thank you very much. Now I have pictures. Oh, yeah, okay. So this is the United States Military Academy at West Point at the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s. In the foreground, it's the riding hall. So riding was still mandatory at West Point for officers until the 1940s or so. The small building above the riding hall, it's the library. And to the left, we have the teaching, the classrooms, and the huge quadrangle building in the middle. That is where the barracks were. And a center above, that's the cadet chapel. And that's a close-up, same buildings. That's our day at West Point, reception day. That's when the new cadets come. And you see they're already bugged with how to greet properly and stuff like that. So they were already mildly hazed, but the real hard hazing would start later. And that's the class of 1905 that is arriving, so there might, somewhere in there might be Patton. Another pictures, I think that's when they have to swear the oath. So I have from the officers whose papers I used mostly. I have before and after pictures. So pictures when they were cadets and pictures later when they were general officers. So, and to the left, you might not recognize him. This is Joe Lawton Collins. So he was one of the most aggressive and one of the best officers of the U.S. Army in the Second World War. He commanded the 7th Corps. And you recognize the guy on the right? It's Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike. So, and he's not smiling, because if you smiled at West Point as a cadet, you were punished at that time. So, and that's Ike as Supreme Commander, and on the right side, that's Collins as Commander of the 7th Corps, and he's getting a medal from Ike. And that's George C. Marshall as a cadet. He was not at West Point, he was at the Virginia Military Institute, VMI. He was first captain. So, and that is 1 week after the landing in Normandy. And in the foreground, it's Ike and George C. Marshall in the middle. So they were already at the beaches. That's Creighton Abrams. He was possibly the best arm or battalion commander the U.S. Army had in the Second World War. And he became Army Chief of Staff later. And that's when he commanded his battalion in the Second World War. So you might not know this guy, but he's very important for the U.S. Army. This is Monk Dixon. He has a class of 1918, and he complained the whole time in his letters and his diaries about the bad education he got at West Point. He was a very smart guy. He wanted to learn everything, and he learned German and stuff. And he became G2 of First Army. And he was the guy who predicted the German counterattack that became the Battle of the Bulge. So he was the only guy who really read all the signs correctly, and he tried to warn the other officers, and nobody would listen to him. And his superior officer even tried to suppress his report. So it's the famous Intel report, number 37, where he predicted German counterattack, and his superior officer tried to suppress it. And in the middle, that's him. So with the mustache, that's Monk Dixon. And the second of the left, that's Courtney Hodges, that's the commanding officer of First Army. That's Matthew Ridgway. He was also one of the very best commanders the U.S. Army had in the Second World War. He's class of 1917, I think. And that's, you know it from the cover of my book. So that's Ridgway in 1943 in Sicily, when he commanded the 82nd Airborne. And later he commanded the 18th Airborne Corps, the Battle of the Bulge. And later in Korea. That's the main cadet institution in Berlin. And it's one classroom. The classes were way, way smaller than at West Point, with only a few cadets, so you could teach better. That's the courtyard. It's when they received mail. And you see they are kind of relaxed, the guys. You will never see West Point cadets relaxed like the German cadets. So they always had to be stiff and so on, but not the Germans. And they could also approach every officer at the courtyard, even the commandant of the whole cadet institution. They could just approach him and talk to him if they had a problem. And one thing the Germans did not trust the cadets with, that was girls. So they were checking the letters if they would receive mail from girlfriends. That was not allowed. So suddenly you have lots of aunts and sisters who are writing who were not aunts and sisters. So that's one of the Kriegsschulen. Those are all ensigns. They are not yet officers, and they have to learn how to shoot machine guns and stuff like that, and you didn't learn that at the West Point. That is the Command and General Staff School. That's Grant Hall. That's where Ike studied, and it's where Patton studied. It's still there. So if you go to 411 Verse in Kansas, you can still see Grant Hall. That's a war game at 411 Verse. That is the famous Kriegsakademie in Berlin. When it was just rebuilt by the Nazis, that's 1934. And that is the first war game of the first class of the new Kriegsakademie. So when you see a civilian in the background, the war games usually started with a scenario that was explained or introduced by some guy from the German Foreign Ministry. So they started a whole explanation how a war situation would start. That is the infantry school at Fort Benning, and in the middle that's George C. Marshall, and many of those who would become very important are in that picture, but they are too small to point them out. So Omar Bradley, that's second on the right, for example. Walter Beadle Smith is in there in the picture, so there's many of those who gain high rank in the Second World War. That's Adolf von Schell. That's the guy who I talked about very briefly in my lecture. He is the German exchange student who helped Marshall run Fort Benning, basically like a small version of the Kriegsakademie. Yeah, that's all the Army commanders and the highest commanders of the U.S. Army. And they're all wearing civilian suits. So, and they did that until 1940 when the press complained. They were all running around. Our highest senior military leaders are running around like suburban taxpayers. And then Marshall ordered them all to wear uniform. But before that, they all wore, were all civilian suits. And in Germany, in contrast, the great majority of all officers did not even own a civilian suit. And that's how it all ended, so should not be forgotten. That is the main cadet institution that became later the barracks for the Waffen-SS. So it should not be forgotten. Okay, so now I'm done. Thank you very much. If you have questions, shoot.
You want me to stand up?
Whatever you like.
I noticed two things. One, I'd like to compliment you on your English. You're very understandable. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And the second thing is I noticed earlier in your talk that you had said there were changes made in the Army at the time of about 1880, 81. And I know that there was a lot of changes about that time in military equipment, such as saddles and things of that nature, sidearms and things. Yeah. And it seems like that happened together. Was those two things contingent on one another from your studies?
I don't think so. I don't think so, no. It really depends. The U.S. Army always had very little money. And it really depends who could press through his own project. So Patton, for example, he was able to introduce a new saber. nobody needed a new saber at the beginning of the 19th century in the U.S. Army, but he just, he had the clout and he had the experience, and he was just coming back from the French cavalry school, and he said, I mean, we need a new saber, so they got a new saber. I think that's pretty much unrelated.
Just a question. You use terms like audacity and flexibility, and yet, from my understanding, the German army was exceptionally known for its discipline, where the enlisted personnel were not allowed to display flexibility. It seems to me as though there's a contradiction here. Would you comment on that, sir?
Yes. So that's a cliche that is left from the times of the early 19th century, when it was indeed the case. And that changed in Germany. And that changed because of Moltke, the editor. I talked about him. He was a chief of staff in Germany. And when he was not yet chief of staff, and he commented during a maneuver that there was too much paperwork. There was way too much paperwork. You cannot command armies and things with writing orders like this. And then he said, an officer should only command what his subordinate did not know by himself. So, and he wanted to teach that to the German army, and that took him 30 years. And that became Auftragstaktik. And I mentioned that. That means that the subordinate only gets taught, you do this, you take the village, but not how he takes the village. And that's a great difference to all the other armies. And that's what the U.S. Army tries to introduce now, because it's so fast, because the subordinates have the initiative. Many orders during the Second World War in the German officer corps, they were not even written down. They were only oral orders. So you are way, way faster than other armies. And that's the thing that the U.S. Army tries to introduce right now, but because they don't understand it properly, it is not working at the moment. So that's, your question is an old cliche about the Germans, that they have this Kadavergehorsam, that's the German word for it, like zombie obedience, that might be the best translation. But it changed at the end of the 19th century when Auftragstaktik became mandatory in the German army.
A lot of the officer corps during World War II was not academy trained. A lot of them were drafted, if for a better term, into the military, either from an ROTC program or they were just commissioned because we grew such a large army for the conflicts. How would you compare that to the forces in Germany at the same time? Weren't they also drafted in many cases the same way?
Yeah, it's the same problem. That's why my study ends in 1940, because then both sides blew up their armies. And I wanted to know, when I looked at culture, I looked at how culture is transported. And culture is transported by the senior officers and by the fixed installations, like schools. So I wanted to know how those guys who became generals, what kind of command culture they have. And I mentioned that during my lecture, that both sides later had 250,000 officers, 250,000 to 280,000. And I could not look at the ROTC program. And in Germany, you had thousands of battlefield commissions later. So, and lots of NCOs every year, up to 6,000 NCOs commissioned to officers, for example. I could not look at that. So I had to look at the generals who would make the command culture. And all the other stuff has to wait until I have a professorship. Then I can do that.
Dr. Dude, I was wondering, first of all, thank you for your wonderful lecture tonight. It was wonderful. I was wondering, looking forward, based on your conclusions and all of the detailed research you've done, what recommendations would you make to our military for our future development?
Yeah. That's a very good question. It's an excellent question. And the problem when people read my book is often they say, no, you cannot, just copy the Wehrmacht. And of course, you cannot copy the Wehrmacht. You should not. It was not a nice army, of course not. But you can take aspects. Certain aspects. And one of the aspects is that the officer corps was very, very small. And when you look at military history, those armies who have the smallest officer corps, they work the best. So the German army was aiming for an officer corps between 3 and 5% of the whole mass of people. But because they had so many casualties during the Second World War, the German armies always had catastrophic officer casualties. They were down to 2%. So they were efficiently leading an army at war with only 2% of officers. And the armies today, they have a bloated officer corps. It's extreme, and it's the worst with generals. So, and the U.S. Army suffers from that. They have now 15.6% officers. And you have one general for about 1,000 officers. So you have way too many guys, way too many chiefs, and not enough Indians. Okay? And officers, if there are too many officers, they're standing on each other's toes. And everybody wants to shine and puts out his elbows and stuff like that. So you have a really a bad command structure. So that is the first thing that what I would recommend to the U.S. Army: cut down your officer corps in half. And then you can select the best people. You can select the best people. You don't have to pull everybody through until he's a major and then look, oh, is he a good major? It's too late already, okay? That would be my first recommendation. Cut down your officer corps. I have a lot more, but it would take too long.
Thanks again for coming and speaking.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier that all of the generals during World War II had choices and made choices. Did you find that they made choices out of arrogance, or did they really believe in what they were fighting for under Hitler?
So in Germany, you have a much more individual officer corps than in the United States. And people always think when they see the Wehrmacht, they see the huge gray mass of people, and they're basically all the same. They were not. So in Germany, individuality was fostered in an officer corps. So Guderian had totally different motivations and reasons to fight than Rommel, for example, or von Manstein. So they were totally different guys. When you read their papers, they have totally different reasons for doing things. So it is impossible to answer that question as a whole. You have really to go down and read their papers. There's one German historian, so he did an outstanding job, and he looked at all the army commanders in the East, and he read all their papers. So, and then you can, make an, come to a conclusion, but not as a mass for all those people. So they, just as an example, some thought really that Germany should get a part of the East, but then they should stop with the whole thing. Some thought they should get back Elsass-Lothringen, that's what the French get back, but then they should stop. Okay, so you have totally different reasons for them. Some never wanted to go to Russia. Some thought it was totally nuts, and others thought, we beat the Russians in 6 weeks. That's not a problem, or even in 4 or so. So you have guys with totally different opinions about the Second World War.
Was there any difference in the culture that was practiced by any of the American generals that came from somewhere other than than West Point? For instance, the Citadel or VMI, where General Marshall was from.
VMI was basically only a clone of West Point. One of the major differences was that the guys at VMI did not need that curriculum with the huge amount of natural sciences, mathematics, and engineering. But the hazing, for example, was the same, and the harshness was the same. You nearly lost, the U.S. nearly lost their best officer, George C. Marshall, during a hazing accident. He was hurt so badly that he nearly could not go back. So that's what hazing is so ridiculous. You don't do that. So, as I told you, I had to take my sample. So I looked only at the guys who came from West Point, and I did not look at all the others. But the West Pointers were the great majority. So if you think about anybody who was not from West Point, it is pretty hard. From the top generals, there were only a few. So most were West Pointers.
Thank you for traveling all the way here to speak with us tonight. When I started my studies of World War II a long time ago, I had a real hard time discerning between the Wehrmacht and the SS. Because they both wore uniforms. I knew one was gray, one was black, but beyond that, it took me a while to really understand that they were substantially different. So I'm presuming from your comments tonight that they're all geared toward the Wehrmacht, and the SS had their own way of doing things and probably their own training academies. Yeah. Was there ever much crossover? Were there Wehrmacht officers who went to the SS or vice versa? And that's my basic.
Yeah. So there was crossover at the beginning because they were so unprofessional. At the beginning, the Waffen-SS was totally unprofessional. There were only the party goons and fanatics and stuff, but they soon found out that you cannot lead divisions that way. So you need professional soldiers. So then they took all the Reichswehr officers, some they were already retired, and asked them if they would come. So and some would come voluntarily because you got promoted very quickly during in the Waffen-SS. So that's where you have to cross over. People who want to become promoted faster, people who thought the Wehrmacht was not modern enough, and all the Reichswehr officers. Answers the question? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd be interested in your studies, whether you compared Patton and Rommel in their histories. Or in
their histories.
However you want to compare decision-making.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Well, they are both very, very interesting people, and they were both mavericks in their own organization. So Rommel did his stuff his own way, and he had great problems with his superiors, and Patton was the same. And Rommel wrote a book, a very influential book, that is called Infantry Attacks. That was translated in English, and Patton had a copy. And he always read about what Rommel would do and what Rommel describes in his book. So that is where they are similar. Totally mavericks in their own organizations, always in trouble with their superiors because of that. Both were all masters of mobile warfare. So they were very good when they could race toward a direction. They were both not very good in defense. So that's where there are similarities. Answers the question? Okay.
I'd be interested in your thoughts and related to the tactical preparations that are coming out of our academy now. I'm kind of a Civil War buff, and I think it's acknowledged that West Point was putting out engineers, not field generals, in Civil War era. And that's why we had such devastating human losses in the way the battles were fought. The tactics weren't near as advanced as the weaponry. So I guess my question is do you feel like we've emerged from that in our current training of our officers is advanced tactically to the point where we're, during the World War II era and then at the current point, if you have a comment on that, are we up to date with what we're teaching these guys?
I didn't catch it. I'm sorry. Can you rephrase that?
How far back do you want me to go? During the World War II era, do you feel like what the academies were putting out, that the officers were tactically up to date with the weaponry that was available to them and methodology that was available to them on the battlefield?
Yeah.
And then currently, you feel like we've made advancements with.
What you're asking is if West Point changed from the Second World War to today? Wow, that's okay. That's a big question. So there's a saying among the cadets of West Point tradition unhindered by 2 centuries of progress. Okay, so that might answer some. So West Point was indeed founded as an engineering school. Yeah, because that was what lacked most in the U.S. Army, engineering knowledge in the War of Independence. So, but already in 1845 or so, West Point became the general recruiting ground for officers of the U.S. Army. But the curriculum did not change. Okay, and even around the beginning of the 19th century, you still have that 70% engineering, mathematics, and natural sciences. And you still have the phenomenon that a guy who fails in mathematics but has outstanding grades in leadership or tactics, that he's still separated from the institution. So this is still the same. The same was also from the Civil War to the Second World War, the hazing problem. So that they denigrated the first-year cadets, the plebes. That they were always, made miserable, that they were outrightly tortured and stuff like that. And you are not making officers like that. So that's another problem. There has never been a study about those cadets who were separated from West Point because they were just tired of the hazing, because they were disappointed with the whole system. They were disappointed with West Point. There's no study about those who left the academy because they were fed up with the system. And MacArthur, when he was superintendent, it was 1919 or 1920 or so, MacArthur, he said already, we have so many people who leave West Point but become so successful in the civilian life that maybe we lose people that we should not lose. So, it is better today. It is better today, yeah. Yes. There's always room for improvement, though.
Okay, I think we'll throw the red flag there. So this gives us, as promised, a great deal to think about, and it is important who we select to go off to these service academies or go into our pre-commissioning programs, whether they're Officer Candidate School or ROTC, and what experiences they have, because they are the people that are going to lead our sons and daughters into harm's way in the future if we need that, and history suggests that we probably will. So Jorg, we thank you very much. We've stuffed him over the last couple days. His tradition is a large breakfast and 2 light meals, but that's not our tradition, and he was asleep, so we'd wake him up, take him off for the big meals that are our tradition at night. He's already told me no more. But anyway, tomorrow or the next day, he goes back to Washington, has some research appointments there, and then back to Germany, and we wish him the very best. And we, of course, have our classical token of appreciation, the 1st Division, big red. Yep, very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Presentation. Thank you. Now, he needs to run right down the aisle here because when I'm done talking, and I'm not done talking, then everybody can go back, and I hope you'll purchase his book, and he'll be back there to sign them, and you can ask him other questions. It's probably very bad form that as soon as one speaker stops speaking, we throw up the sign for the next speaker. But that's okay. This is our next speaker, Wednesday, December 4th. Some of you may know Ann Keating. She's a professor at North Central College. She's published several different works on the history of Chicago and the suburbs. And this book, I think, is a 2012, maybe even early 2013, Rising Up from Indian Country, the Battle of Fort Dearborn, and the Birth of Chicago. I don't think there's a tie there to the 1st Infantry Division, but because it is such an interesting piece of local military history, we wanted Ann to come up and talk about it. There is a tie to West Point. And now I can't remember the officer's name, and I apologize for that. But the first West Point graduate to be killed in action serving his country was killed at the Battle of Fort Dearborn outside of Chicago. And there is a small monument on the south side to him, and his rank at the time was ensign. The lowest commissioned officer rank in the Army at that time was ensign, as it still is in the Navy and the Coast Guard, because that was the British tradition. And there has been criticism of West Point and the Army school system since 1802 when that institution was founded, but it is also the case that West Point has generated many general officers, many brave young men whose names are on our monuments all around the world because they gave their lives for their country heroically and competently. And the occasional President of the United States has been a West Point graduate. So it is not a failed institution, but it's an institution that belongs to us and not to the brass. And we should have a keen interest in what it does with the citizens we send there to lead the citizens that we will take into battle someday. Thank you. I did graduate there, so I felt I had to say that. And can we put the next slide up? Last thing, if you don't know about this wonderful institution, you should. It's in Wheaton. It is 501c3 nonprofit grassroots institution that addresses a profound problem in the United States, which is a significant proportion of our homeless population are honorably discharged veterans of the armed services. That should not be the case. And the estimates for how many homeless veterans there are walking the streets of the state of Illinois today are pretty significant. This institution, founded by my good friend Bob Adams, a Caisson Marine, is trying to do something about it. If you got any spare change, you can drop it in the red, white, and blue mailbox out on the veteran welcome table, and we will see that that goes to the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans. This past Saturday, we had a 5K run here that raised over $7,000 for the Midwest Shelter, and a pancake breakfast that raised another $1,000, as well as for our local Legion post that does so much good in other community services around here. So please consider that. I think that's it, but Veterans Day is coming November 11th, Monday, November 11th. So if nothing else, please find a veteran to thank for his or her service. And if you come here, we'll have our annual luminary display Monday evening. Also in this room, we'll have 2 showings of the program War Letters, which is a presentation by reenactors using actual letters home from our servicemen and women from the Revolution to Afghanistan. And that will be at 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., and there's other activities during the day. So Veterans Day is an important day to pick any one of the many people probably sitting in this office. So just for the heck of it, since it's Veterans Day, how about all the veterans stand up? And we thank you guys and gals, if there are any standing there, we thank you for your service. Okay, that's it. Thanks for coming. See you on Monday, I hope.